Viewers, over the last 48 hours, in fact, India has reported more than 4 lakh coronavirus cases. That's right, there has been a steep rise in COVID cases in just last 48 hours. As a result, there is a lot of uncertainty among migrant laborers from states like Maharashtra. They have started returning back to their own states like UP, Bihar, etc. As a result, there is now extreme amount of concern regarding the economic impact of these number of restrictions that various states have started imposing. In fact, today, over the next 30 minutes, we are going to be focusing on the issue of jobs. Here on Times Now, every day we are assessing the economic impact this second wave of coronavirus can have for India. But here, instead of just focusing on the problems, we are going to be talking to experts to find out solutions which can be implemented immediately to help India have as little impact as possible. Today, the focus is the issue of unemployment. According to the recent report by CMIE, in fact, fresh restrictions in the last few days of April have already pushed India's unemployment rate to over about 8.5%. And this is alarming. What does it mean? Let's find out from the man himself who has written this report. We have with us Mr. Mahesh Vyas of the CMIE joining us on Times Now. Good afternoon, Mr. Mahesh Vyas. Thank you very much for speaking with us here on Times Now. Your data is quite alarming. In just 2 weeks, the unemployment rate has gone up significantly. Can you decode these numbers for our viewers, sir?
So what you're seeing as the 8.5% unemployment rate refers to the unemployment rate as of the week ended 14th of April. Now, the week ended, the earlier week also had more than 8% unemployment rate. These rates are quite high compared to the preceding few months when we had seen the unemployment rate stabilize around 6.5% or so. Now, 6.5% unemployment rate is not good. It's quite high compared to what India historically had, around 3% or so. But we went up to 6.5%, and now, in just a matter of a couple of weeks, in April, we have seen this go up to 8.5%. I think that's a bit too high. And what's worrying along with it is that the labor participation rate has also come down. So we have a double whammy, a falling labor participation rate and a rising unemployment rate. So the labor participation rate was down to nearly 40%, compared to 42% that we had in the earlier year. So what we are looking at is 2% of the working age population have exited the labor market. So this is kind of stressful.
Right. And in your report, sir, you've also mentioned that about 9.8 million salaried jobs were lost in 2020-21. And the people who lost their jobs, in fact, they don't want to return back. They have probably looked for another occupation, or they're currently jobless.
So what's happened is the numbers of March 2021 are compared with the numbers for 2019-20. So that's the pre-pandemic time, which is 1920. And we look at what the situation in March 21 is. We don't take the average for 2021 because that's got too much of up and down in it. So I look at the situation in March 21 and compare it to normal times. And what I find is that we have 5.5 million less jobs. But that's the aggregate. That hides a lot of trouble that's underlying it. And the biggest underlying problem over there is that salaried people have taken the biggest hit. And this has been a worrying factor for a long time. Initially, salaried people did not get impacted, but slowly they did get impacted. And by the end of the year, we have 10 million salaried jobs lost. That's really stressful. Now, what has happened is people who lose their jobs don't seem to be finding jobs in the same occupation. So if you are working as something and then that industry has wound down, for example, you could be in the aviation industry, or you could have been in some hotels and restaurants industry, and you don't get a job in that. So you're going to move to some other occupations. Now, the biggest movement that we have seen, which is the most worrisome part, is that people have moved from non-farm jobs to farm jobs. which means that people who had salary jobs or better quality jobs in urban India or even in rural India have gone back to their farms, and they claim they're doing farming over there. Now, there's a huge increase, 8% increase in labor under farming, but there is only a 2 to 3% increase in the production of agriculture. So that means labor productivity in agriculture has fallen very dramatically. This is all disguised unemployment. So this shows the stress that is going on in the labor market. People are losing good quality jobs, going back to their farms where they're practically unemployed, but they declare themselves to be employed. So there is a greater stress than the 5 million, 5.5 million job losses that we are talking about.
Can you also tell us a little bit about, how worse is the situation during this second wave of coronavirus? You've been tracking the data since many, many years. Now, if you compare this to last year in March, when the complete lockdown and that phase really started, and if you compare that to what we are witnessing right now and the curfews and the restrictions that have come, what is the difference and what is the outlook from here on? What is your assessment?
Well, the situation isn't as bad as it was in the first pandemic. So in April of 2020, we were in a much, much more difficult spot. The unemployment rate had gone up to 24% in those times. And we're talking of 8.5% now. So certainly we are not as bad as we were then. The lockdown itself is not as stringent as it was then. As per Oxford institution, which measures the stringency, when the number in April 2020 was around 100, now it's I think around 93, 94 or so. So one, the stringency of the lockdown is not that high, and the impact on the unemployment rate is not that high. 24% then, 8.5% now. But we need to be mindful of one thing, that 2% of the working population has exited. They are not coming back. So I think we seem to have sustained a more lasting damage. And on top of that lasting damage, we've got this rise up to 8.5%. So let's say, in a sense, we're not as bad as we were then, but it's not a pretty spot to be in.
All right. I think those are some really important numbers that you've given to us. And of course, it seems that, the government will have to monitor the situation very, very closely. Thank you very much, Mr. Mahesh Vyas, for explaining to us how the situation is on the ground as far as the unemployment rate is concerned. We are going to be slipping into a very short break at this point in time. But when we return, viewers, we will, of course, be discussing the kind of solutions that the government can consider to deal with the situation that Mr. Mahesh Vyas has just now explained to us. Stay with us on Times Now. Welcome back here with us on Times Now, and today we are discussing the impact of the second wave of coronavirus, the curfews and the restrictions that it has brought on the job market in the country. We just spoke to Mahesh Vyas of the CMIE, who seemed to suggest that fresh restrictions have already pushed the unemployment rate to about 8.6% for the week ending 11th of April. Situation is looking quite grim. Let's now welcome our guest joining us on the broadcast today to discuss it and to talk about the solutions from here on. We have Ajit Pai, Officer on Special Duty to Vice Chairman Niti Aayog, joining us on the broadcast. We also have with us Rituparna Chakravarti, co-founder and VP Team Lease. Thank you very much, both of you, for joining us today. Rituparna Chakravarti, let me begin this discussion with you. We've got one view from the CMIE, especially about the informal sector. In your assessment, how are the current restrictions and curfews impacting the job market?
Let me just set a bit of the context about what's happening for the last couple of quarters before we comment on what's happening currently. So I think the Indian economy has been regaining the lost ground, and the same was reflecting in hiring as well. Like be it the IMF, OECD or Fitch, all have been positive, and this was bolstering the business sentiment and intent to hire. However, if we resort to lockdowns, it will derail and of course further delay the recovery. In fact, it will impact the scope of growth in employment in a not so pleasant manner. And I think if we continue with our efforts, of course, and not opt for lockdown, the business optimism will remain intact, and so the hiring. We have actually seen, I mean, there's a study that we've been doing called the Team Lease Employment Outlook Report. We kind of survey of 800 odd organizations across 21 sectors, 14 cities. So from 27% intent to hire in the previous quarter, it has come up to 34% in the current quarter.
Right.
However, lots have changed in the last 4 weeks, which we understand. But however, it's important to also know that organizations are no more surprised by COVID. Organizations are far more prepared. They're far more resilient. They've built in the ecosystem. They've built in the flexibility. They are agile, if I may say so. And they also have been pushed to the corner when it comes to the existing headcount. I mean, more or less, everybody is operating at a very bare minimum headcount. So they do need to hire to be able to take on what's coming on the way. We have to stay away from lockdowns, restrictions. That's all industries want right now.
Okay, industry has got one demand. They don't like the L word. They don't want to see lockdown. Mr. Ajit Pai, what is happening? More than 4 lakh cases, sir, have come in just 48 hours. It began with Maharashtra. Now other states as well have also started imposing either weekend curfew or have intensified their night curfew. If the case count continues like this, how far are we from a national lockdown for a few days?
So to address that question, I think I would second what the prior speaker said already, that the current scenario is very different from where we were prior to the first lockdown. So when we are heading into the first lockdown, the number of knowns were very, very few, and the number of unknowns were very many. So at that point of time, I think for the nation to actually go in for a lockdown, as a nationwide lockdown, made a lot of sense, or it was what I would call, from a risk assessment perspective, could have been justified. Right now, when you're having a look at it, we understand the disease much better. Maybe not as much as we'd like, but much better than we did back then. The number of knowns have increased, number of unknowns have gone down. And the approach so far of the government, the central government, has been that it is something that can be tackled at a local level wherever the hotspots, wherever things are increasing, and there are selective ways that are isolated that can be used to contain this. So having a nationwide lockdown where big chunks of the economy, where the disease is not prevalent and the infection is not spreading as rapidly as it is in others, may be unnecessary at this stage, even though the nationwide numbers are alarmingly high. So you're absolutely right. It's twice what it was at the peak of the sort of last surge, the first surge, and it's something of great concern. But the vast majority of these are in just 10 states. So we know that more than 80% of the new cases are just in these 10 areas. And if even in these areas we are selective in what you can call surgical in our approach towards containing it, I think we can check the need to have a much broader lockdown. On the second front, when you talk about employment, what I would say is that employment and consumer sentiment are lagging indicators. So these are things that generally start improving only once the economy and actual production has started increasing, capacity utilization is rising. At this stage, the government is very focused on sort of long-term drivers of creating this employment using government initiatives, especially on the infrastructure side. It's doing a lot of work where the employment elasticity is 5 times. So that is the main thrust, which can happen regardless of whether these lockdowns are happening or not. You have the national infrastructure pipeline. You've got 111 lakh crores of capital that can get deployed there by central government, state governments, and the private sector. And that would be the approach, I think, that they are pushing on to ensure that despite all this volatility that can come with the second wave and regional issues, overall as a country, the economy continues to hold its course.
Well, It's good to hear the plans and the focus that the government has right now. But Mr. Ajit Pai, the question is immediately, what is it that the government is thinking to help the sectors which are going to bear the brunt of these curfews, these restrictions? The services industry, the restaurant industry, the tourism industry. I mean, they are suffering. The aviation sector, for that matter. Is the government thinking of another kind of a stimulus or some kind of a help for them?
So at this stage, I think the focus is to see as has been rightly pointed out, we are watching a recovery where even indicators that are forward indicators, 3 to 6 month indicators, as recently as the 1st of April, which was the March numbers, were in the mid 50s for the PMI, the Purchasing Managers Index, both for services as well as for manufacturing. So some of the data is very, very recent. The spike has been very fast this time with this disease. So the lockdowns are still, a percentage of the economy that is being impacted by it is still being studied. And once it's studied and if it's felt necessary, I'm sure the government will come out, the central government will be looking at, whether, additional, help is required.
Right. I give you the last word, Rituparna Chakraborty. You've heard, in a way, what the government is doing at this point in time. We do see a lot of job opportunities coming, but will they actually now translate into the offer letters, considering the kind of uncertainty that has now come in?
So I think I'll talk about the sectors with, in spite of what's going on, will I feel continue to maintain the hiring momentum. I think healthcare, pharma, obviously, educational services, e-com, technology startup, technology per se, telecom, agriculture. But having said that, I think when you ask that question, that what do we need to do? And if I were to, I have been asking the same questions to the industrial fraternity and the different companies and organizations. What they essentially want right now is that please create massive awareness around vaccinations, open up the entire vaccination process to a larger audience, improve testing, make it more accessible, bring it closer to us, make it more affordable. If these things happen, they feel that at the moment, currently, we probably will be able to make a difference. And the anticipation of this becoming worse can be tackled and handled better. So essentially, that's what can help the entire employment scenario.
Right. I think you've made a fantastic point, Rituparna Chakraborty. Public awareness is something which is the need of the hour, apart from many other things that we have in our arsenal to fight this war against coronavirus. Rituparna Chakraborty as well as Ajit Pai, I appreciate both of you for joining us here on this special broadcast. We'll split into a very short break. Stay with us.